They called it just another border crossing, a railway station, a knot of tracks and tunnels in the middle of a divided city. But for the people who lived in Cold War Berlin, the name Friedrichstrasse meant something very different. It meant checkpoints, suspicion, and the feeling that beneath your feet, somewhere in the darkness, someone might be digging for freedom. In the early 1960s, as the concrete scars of the Berlin Wall hardened across the city, a handful of young men and women decided that if they couldn't go over the wall and couldn't get through the checkpoints, they would go under it. They weren't soldiers, they weren't government engineers. Most of them were students, mechanics, or recent refugees from the East. But they had one advantage the regime could never quite crush: imagination. This is the story of an ambitious tunnel project that many in the West would later remember as the Friedrichstrasse Tunnel, a plan to reach the underground arteries near the Friedrichstrasse rail hub, to connect basements, service corridors, even the ghostly U-Bahn lines, and to turn the carefully controlled border into a hidden escape route. It was partially successful, daring beyond belief, and ultimately discovered before its full potential could be unleashed. To understand why anyone would risk their life underground, you have to see Berlin as it looked in 1961 and 1962. Overnight, a city that had been a single living organism was sliced in half. Streets were cut, tracks were severed. U-Bahn and S-Bahn lines that once ran freely through the capital suddenly became a maze of ghost stations, where trains from West Berlin rumbled through dim, sealed platforms in the east without ever stopping. The Friedrichstrasse station sat at the heart of that maze. Above ground, it was a tightly controlled border crossing, a place where East German guards scrutinized passports and faces under fluorescent lights. Below ground, its tangle of tunnels, platforms, and connecting corridors lay at the junction of East and West, a tantalizing symbol of what had once been an open, modern network. For the men of the East German secret police, the Stasi, Friedrichstrasse represented control. They turned it into an island of the GDR inside West Berlin, surrounded by walls, checkpoints, and surveillance. For a very different kind of man, the kind who looked at a map and saw possibilities, it represented something else, a structural weakness in the Iron Curtain. In January 1962, only a few months after the wall went up, a group of determined Berliners dug one of the first successful escape tunnels of the Cold War. They worked from a basement on the western side, hacking through 27 meters of earth to reach a courtyard in the east. On January 24th, 28 people crawled through that tunnel to freedom. It was short, crude, and incredibly dangerous, but it worked. That success set off what could only be described as an underground arms race. In the first half of 1962 alone, at least 6 tunnels carried about 60 people from east to west beneath the wall. Each escape made headlines. Each escape humiliated the East German regime, and each success forced the Stasi to adapt, to bring more technology and more manpower into the hunt for tunnels. For ordinary East Berliners, these stories were whispers, rumors shared in kitchens and hallways. For the Stasi, they were data points. The secret police began deploying seismic sensors to pick up vibrations from digging, microphones to catch the faint scrape of shovels, and systematic patrols along the border strip. They studied soil types, looked for subsidence, and even drew up plans to blow up tunnels with explosives if needed. In this quiet war beneath the wall, they were determined to win. But they weren't the only ones capable of thinking like engineers. In West Berlin, across the barricades from Friedrichstrasse, an unlikely group was meeting: students from the Technical University, former East German refugees, and young men with a mix of idealism and personal motives. Some wanted to bring out girlfriends or family. Others simply wanted to strike back at the regime that had sealed them out of their old neighborhoods. They looked at the early tunnels and saw something both inspiring and incomplete. Those first escapes had proved that the wall could be undermined, but the tunnels were short, noisy, and shallow. They flooded, collapsed, and left behind obvious traces. What if, they asked, they could build a tunnel that looked less like a desperate hole and more like a proper underground work, something that drew on the same kind of technical knowledge used to build the U-Bahn itself? From that question grew one of the most ambitious escape projects of the Cold War, a plan that would later be seen as the high-water mark of tunnel engineering in divided Berlin. The idea was simple and audacious at the same time: to start from a warehouse or factory basement on the western side, drive a long, deep tunnel under the border zone, and connect to a cellar or service corridor in the east that lay within walking distance of key transit arteries, including the lines that converged near Friedrichstrasse. The men behind this tunnel treated it like a civil engineering project, not merely an act of desperation. They measured distances carefully. They calculated gradients to ensure proper drainage. They studied soil charts to determine how deep they needed to go to avoid groundwater while still staying below the range of casual detection. In some sections, they dug down nearly 8 meters. Inside the tunnel, they installed timber supports at regular intervals, created a narrow-gauge track for a small hand-pushed cart to haul out earth, and strung electric lights along the ceiling. In the words of one American report that later described it, this was perhaps the most sophisticated escape tunnel constructed beneath the Berlin Wall up to that time. One of the driving figures in this effort had already beaten the system once. His name was Uli Pfeiffer, and in September 1961, he had escaped from East Berlin through the sewer system near the Glimm Tunnel, exploiting a gap in the rapidly tightening border regime. That experience left him with two things: a personal score to settle and an intimate knowledge of how the city's underground infrastructure could be used against the regime. Now, working with fellow refugee Hasso Herschel and a cadre of technical university students, Pfeiffer set his sights on a bigger target. The tunnel they envisioned would be roughly 140 yards long, deep enough to avoid the Stasi's earliest seismic detectors, and robust enough to handle multiple waves of fugitives. They weren't content to pull out a handful of people. They wanted to move dozens. Family members, friends, and strangers desperate enough to trust a path they could neither see nor verify. Above their heads, the trains of the U-Bahn and S-Bahn rattled through their new reality. Lines that once connected neighborhoods now glided through ghost stations in the east, where platforms were dim, guarded, and off-limits to ordinary East Germans. Trains from West Berlin would slow slightly, slide past the shadowy figures of armed police on the platforms, and accelerate again into the west. To the tunnelers, that network was both a metaphor and a guide. They could not hope to tap directly into the high-security platforms at Friedrichstrasse, but they could aim their project toward the same axis of movement, toward streets and basements threaded above the buried rails that converged there. If they could bring people into the West near that key hub, close enough to walk to stations that still belonged to West Berlin, they would have transformed one of the regime's proudest border installations into an indirect escape route. Planning the human side of the operation was as complicated as planning the tunnel itself. It wasn't enough to dig. They had to recruit trustworthy people in the East, pass instructions without tipping off the Stasi, and choreograph the moment when dozens of people would vanish from their apartments and reappear hours later on the other side of the world's most guarded border. To do that, they built a signaling system straight out of a spy novel. In some cases, they used coded messages in newspapers, marking certain classified ads or obituaries to indicate that a rendezvous was on. In others, they drove through East Berlin in cars painted with fake business logos. One vehicle, posing as a cosmetics company, used the initial letters of its made-up name to point insiders to Brunnenstrasse, the street where one of the East Side exits was planned. The Stasi, for its part, was not standing still. It had informants in factories, in churches, in youth groups. It had eyes and ears in border units and in the East German railway system. Every time a tunnel succeeded, the pressure came down harder on anyone who might be connected. Every time a new rumor surfaced about people disappearing into basements near the border, the secret police redrew their maps and refined their monitoring. For months, the diggers on the western side worked in shifts. They went to jobs or classes during the day, then descended into the earth at night, scraping, shoring, and pushing cartloads of sand and clay back to be hidden in crawl spaces and storage rooms. The air in the tunnel was thick with humidity and fear. A cave-in could bury them alive. A miscalculated angle could bring them up underneath a patrol road full of border guards instead of under a safe cellar. A single informant could doom not just them, but everyone waiting on the other side. While this ambitious, deep-dig tunnel crept forward, another project less than a mile away was nearing completion, a smaller, shallower passage running from a courtyard in West Berlin under the border to the basement of a building in the east. It was the tunnel that would come to be known as Tunnel 29. Tunnel 29 was a different kind of operation, still risky, still technical, but more improvisational. It started from a factory at Bernauer Strasse 78 in the west and aimed at a house on Schönholzer Strasse in the east. Over 3 months, a rotating crew of 40 students and escape helpers dug their way across. The soil was heavy, the risk constant, but in mid-September 1962, they broke through into the basement of the target building. In 2 days, 29 people crawled through that narrow, muddy pipe to freedom. Parents, children, lovers. Some were brought out on the very day that East German guards began quietly evacuating the building, unaware that the real threat lay beneath their boots. The operation was a propaganda coup for the West. News cameras and reporters captured the story. Around the world, people watched the images and marveled that unarmed civilians could tunnel under a system that prided itself on total control. The East German regime was furious. Its leaders had invested enormous resources in turning Berlin into a sealed border. Now, in front of the international press, a gang of young diggers had made them look clumsy and weak. For the men of the Stasi, it was more than an embarrassment. It was proof that their technological edge at the border was not yet complete. They stepped up their efforts to catch the next big tunnel. In that atmosphere of heightened tension, the deeper, more complex project, what many would later remember as the Friedrichstrasse Tunnel, entered its most dangerous phase. The diggers had covered much of the horizontal distance. Their exit point in the east had been chosen, a basement that lay in a neighborhood threaded above the underground lines leading toward Friedrichstrasse and other central hubs. They were within weeks, maybe even days, of being able to bring people through. But the underground war had attracted more than just local attention. Western media, including networks from the United States, had already financed a previous project, turning footage of the escape into a primetime documentary called The Tunnel. The story of young Berliners using engineering and daring to defy a Soviet-backed regime resonated deeply with American audiences, who saw it as a symbol of the larger struggle between free societies and communist control. East German officials knew this. Every new tunnel did not just represent a loss of human capital, it was a public relations disaster in the information war with the West. And in that war, the United States held a decisive advantage, a global media machine and a technological base capable of broadcasting these stories to millions. As the Friedrichstrasse tunnel neared completion, the Stasi's technical units were deploying better seismic equipment along key sectors of the border. They were correlating anonymous tips with odd noises, studying slight dips in the ground, and mapping any disturbances in the carefully leveled strip of death that ran along the wall. In at least one case in 1962, Stasi plans called for planting explosives to collapse a suspected tunnel, evidence of how far they were prepared to go to stop the underground exodus. In the western side, in the building that was supposed to be the end of the tunnel, escape helpers living double lives walked a tightrope. By day, they had to act like loyal citizens, going to work, attending meetings, keeping up appearances. By night, they coordinated with couriers from the west, passed along instructions, and watched for any sign that suspicions were tightening around them. One evening, in that building's basement, a guard posted by the escape network looked out into the shadows and saw something that turned his blood cold. Behind a pillar, just out of the light, he caught the outline of boots and legs, men standing too still in the wrong place at the wrong hour. The instinctive sense that the Stasi had already arrived hit him before any words were spoken. The warning raced back through the underground chain. On the western side, the diggers understood instantly. They had pushed their luck as far as they could go. They scrambled back through their own tunnel, carrying tools, smashing lights, doing what they could in minutes to make the passage less obvious. They had invested months of work, drawn up careful plans, and constructed a tunnel that was, in many ways, ahead of its time, well-shored, deep, and technically impressive. But with the Stasi closing in, they had to abandon any thought of bringing people through. In the end, the tunnel served only one group of fugitives, the diggers themselves, retreating to safety. For the East German regime, discovering the tunnel was a victory. It proved that their technology and informant network were catching up to the creativity of the escape helpers. For the Stasi, it was a real-world test of their new methods, seismic detection, surveillance, and rapid response at the border. But beneath that surface, there was an uncomfortable truth. To stop unarmed civilians armed only with shovels and a bit of technical knowledge, a regime backed by the full might of the Soviet Union had been forced to deploy sophisticated sensors, specialized engineering teams, and layers of armed guards. It was an uneven contest in one sense, men with guns and machines versus men with picks and wooden braces, but in another sense, it was deeply symbolic. Every meter of tunnel represented a triumph of human ingenuity over a system that claimed to control every square inch of its territory. By the end of 1962, the statistics told a stark story. In the first half of the year, 6 tunnels had successfully carried about 60 people to freedom. In the second half, with the Stasi fully mobilized, only 1 tunnel succeeded. 8 attempts failed, around 20 people were arrested. The balance underground had shifted toward the regime. Yet even then, even as the technology of repression improved, the legend of the tunnels continued to grow, especially in the West. American newspapers and television shows portrayed the diggers as protagonists in a real-life war movie. Berlin became, in the American imagination, the front line of a global struggle, students with engineering textbooks and hand tools facing off against a communist system that had to throw its entire security apparatus at the problem just to keep its citizens from crawling away. From a distance, it was easy to see the broader pattern. The Berlin Wall itself, its watchtowers, its anti-vehicle ditches, its control strips, was a monument to fear. It was an attempt to use concrete, barbed wire, and technology to trap people inside a system that could not compete with the living standards and freedoms of the West. The tunnels, by contrast, were monuments to something else, the refusal to accept that arrangement, the willingness to apply knowledge and imagination to claw out a narrow, dangerous path toward a different life. Americans looked at that contrast and recognized something familiar. In their own national story, technological progress had always been tied to individual initiative, inventors, entrepreneurs, and ordinary citizens solving problems from the bottom up. In Berlin, under the shadow of Soviet-backed watchtowers, that same spirit appeared in a new form. Young people who had grown up in the ruins of war were turning a divided city into their laboratory, testing whether engineering and courage could overcome the most militarized border on Earth. The East German and Soviet authorities, for all their rigid planning and secret files, found themselves reacting. They built bigger walls, deployed more sensors, wrote more regulations. They did not create, they replied. The technological edge stayed in many ways with the West, not only in weapons and computers, but in the flexibility to innovate at the level of individuals and small groups. When people today speak of the Friedrichstrasse Tunnel, they are often compressing several different stories into one. They think of the sophisticated, deep-dug escape attempt of 1962 that was betrayed before it could fulfill its promise. They think of Tunnel 29, where 29 people scrambled to freedom under the noses of the guards. They think of the broader pattern of U-Bahn lines, ghost stations, and basements that turned Berlin into a three-dimensional battlefield. As a single, unified operation, Tunnel Friedrichstrasse is more a symbol than a proper name. But as a symbol, it captures something essential about the Cold War. It captures the moment when a communist regime, backed by tanks and jets and the full weight of the Soviet bloc, found itself challenged not by American armies rolling across plains, but by students with shovels trying to reach a station where trains once ran freely. In the end, some tunnels succeeded, others failed, and many lives were lost in the attempt. Over the life of the wall, at least 19 tunnels managed to bring around 250 people to the West, out of more than 70 serious attempts. Dozens of would-be escapees were caught, and some were shot. The Stasi's technology and ruthlessness were real, so was the risk. But the tunnels left a legacy the wall never could. The wall is gone. The regime that built it collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, its economic stagnation, and its inability to match the West's combination of technological innovation and political resilience. The tunnels, or at least their stories, remain. Today, visitors can stand on Bernauer Strasse, see preserved sections of the border, and even descend into parts of old escape routes. Documentaries like The Tunnel and Tunnel to Freedom bring those nights of digging back to life. Books and podcasts recount how young Berliners, watched from above by Soviet-backed towers, turned the ground itself into an ally. For American viewers, these stories still carry the same charge they did in the 1960s. They inspire pride in a world where the side of openness, innovation, and alliance ultimately prevailed. They provoke fascination with the sheer ingenuity it took to challenge a system that claimed to be unchallengeable. And they evoke curiosity about how even in the darkest corners of the Cold War, the desire to be free could drill through concrete, barbed wire, and fear, aiming for the lights of a station whose name, Friedrichstrasse, once meant both border and possibility.